I always forget to check this before I hit record, like what the day actually is. Today is Thursday, August 24th, 2023. It is approximately 9:53 a.m. My name is Alissa Rae Funderburk, and I'm here at the COFO Center with Miss Angela Stewart for part 2 of her oral history interview. Miss Stewart, do I have your permission to record this?
Yes.
Thank you. And for the record, can you spell your name for us?
Yes. Angela, Angela, Stewart, Stewart.
Excellent. So the last time we spoke, we talked a lot about your upbringing, growing up in Jackson, your family, your education background, and all of that. Today, I'd really like to sort of focus on your professional career, your work as it is at the Margaret Walker Center. So can you tell us how you came to be the archivist at the Margaret Walker Center?
Okay. Yes. I received my bachelor's degree in American history from Alcorn State University. And I had the opportunity to go to Kent State in Kent, Ohio for graduate school. And I chose the public history option, which gave me the opportunity to actually work with Dr. Lonnie Bunch at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History as a researcher for an upcoming exhibit. I was primarily looking at the significance of the Tuskegee syphilis study. But I also got to work in museums and archives. I've spent a great deal of time at the Bioethics Archive and Library at Georgetown University and at the Howard University Founders Library doing research. And then I came back to Mississippi and I had the opportunity to become the archivist at the Pontywood School. It was interesting. I was actually attending a workshop held by the Margaret Walker Center under Dr. Albertine Harrison on collecting your past. And while there, we introduced ourselves, and the Pontywood School had 2 individuals stand up, said they were looking for an archivist. I said, I'm an archivist looking for a job, and so I interviewed, and for 12 years I worked as an archivist at the Pontywood School. Dr. Jones founded the Pontywood School in 1909, and in 1909 he started documenting the Pontywood School experience. He hired professional photographers to document the growth of the school. Dr. Jones in 1909 had plans that wouldn't come into fruition until about the 40s and 50s, but he was already had land use plans, things, how he wanted to lay out buildings he wanted to build, and he documented all of that. And he never threw away anything. Matter of fact, people used to say when they would go to his room once he retired, you had to stand and navigate how you were actually going to get to him because he had stuff everywhere. But it was wonderful. He had copies of all of his correspondence. He had photographs. He had documents in terms of fundraising and all that. So I did that for 12 years in addition to working in the library with the students in the evenings as well, since Pontywood is a boarding school, and the library was the place they had to go after 5 in the evening, and that's where I worked there. Dr. Albertine Harrison is a Pontywood alum. When I first arrived at Pontywood, she was the alumni representative to the board of directors. When Shamika Simmons left Jackson State as the archivist at the Margaret Walker Center, Dr. Harrison reached out to me and asked if I would like to come. And I started November 1st, 2004 at the Margaret Walker Center. And a little bit about archives in the Margaret Walker Center and at Jackson State. Early on, African Americans believed to be significant, you had to have stuff. You had to prove that you existed and have examples of your accomplishment. So they developed archives. For a long time, the only archive at Jackson State was the university archives. So there are a lot of things that we have both in the Margaret Walker Center archives and that are also in the library archives, because for the first over 10 years of the center's existence, it didn't have an archival component. So and Margaret Walker's dad told her as a child, you need to collect your stuff. She's like, I don't have papers. But he was always encouraging her to keep track of her things. And so she had all of her papers as well. But Dr. Albertine Harrison, when she came to Jackson State from Southern University, one of her first interests was oral history. So she did a oral history of the Pineywood School, which would become a book. She did oral histories with her students. For example, she had students to lead oral history projects such as Head Start and life in Clinton, Mississippi, life during segregation, what it was like to attend church in the Black community during the era of segregation. So that's where she started in the 1970s with oral histories. Because here again, when the Margaret Walker Center started, it started as one room in the Blackburn building, and then it expanded to 2 rooms in the Blackburn building, because it was founded as the Institute for the Study of History, Life, and Culture of Black People. And Dr. Margaret Walker Alexander was a faculty member in the Language Arts Department, and that's where the Language Arts Department was housed. Matter of fact, the Blackburn building is named for Willie Dobbs Blackburn, who was Margaret Walker's chair in the Language Arts Department. So that's how it started. But also Margaret Walker had great friends in the library. Mrs. Bernice Lloyd Bell, Mrs. Ernestine Lipscomb, her soror, Dr. Lydia Gaston Rhodes, who would go on to become the first African-American head of the Mississippi Library Association. So our earliest collections, like I said, we still had them at the center, but there are also documents in the library as well. Dr. Harrison kind of pivoted from oral histories to archives. She had the opportunity to do an archival study of collections across the state of Mississippi. So from as far north as West Point, Mississippi, to as far south as Alcorn State University and Port Gibson and Vicksburg and Natchez. She was able just to go around the state looking at and analyzing collections, and it would become a survey project under Cynthia Patterson King, who was the first professional archivist at the Margaret Walker Center. And our earliest collections, the John Wesley Jackson collection, Women Power Unlimited, Oxford Development Association, Henry and, I should say, H.T. and Cleopatra Thompson, John and Frida Powell, all of those are collections. The Levi Rowan photograph collection, all of those collections came out of the survey project. Margaret Walker had most of her papers at her house on what was then Gons Avenue. And as she was approaching the end of her life, she knew they couldn't stay there, and she really wanted them at Jackson State. She had had inquiries from her alma mater, the University of Iowa, from Yale University's Beinecke Library and the James Weldon Johnson collection there, but she really wanted them at Jackson State after spending 30 years at Jackson State and founding the Institute. So Jackson State actually purchased her papers, and through a process of about 3 deposits, we received her papers. Christina Wolf and Dr. Rico Chapman, who's our new College of Liberal Arts dean, did the processing of the Margaret Walker papers. So that's another significant collection we have. And then Dr. Roderick R. Page was a 1955 graduate of Jackson State. He came back for his 50th reunion, and he decided he wanted to donate his Department of Education papers. And I literally came to work one day, and there were like almost 60 moving boxes of material in the lobby on the first floor of Air Hall from Washington, D.C. And so we have, if you ever want to know what it means to be a cabinet level official, what it means to be Secretary of Education, the impact of No Child Left Behind, we have all of those papers in the Roderick R. Page collection at the center. Since being at the Margaret Walker Center, I've had the opportunity to do further training. I attended the Modern Archives Institute that is sponsored by the National Archives and Records Administration. And we were both at the main branch in Washington, D.C., near the mall, which is located near the mall, but also the College Park campus. We worked there as well. So I had the opportunity to do that, as well as I attended a copyright workshop sponsored by the Society of American Archivists, and it was interesting. I get there, and one of the first things that the person leading the workshop said was, "Have you heard of the Wright versus Walker case?" And I said, "Yes," because I work at the Margaret Walker Center, and Ellen Wright did not want Margaret Walker to use Richard Wright's papers, which were at the Beinecke Library, and she sued to prevent her from being able to use them because she didn't trust the kind of biography she thought Margaret Walker was going to write with them. And it went to court, and it was decided fair use said that anybody could use them, including Margaret Walker. So she did get the opportunity to use the Richard Wright collection at the Beinecke Library. So it was interesting going to a copyright workshop and find out one of the landmark cases, a case right here at the Margaret Walker Center. And I've had the opportunity to traditionally process collections such as the Roderick Page collection. Julius Thompson, who had previously taught at Jackson State and at the time of his death was director of the Black Studies program at the University of Missouri, Columbia. We have all of his papers, and his collection has literally become one of our largest collections. So if you're interested in anything dealing with Black arts, music, and poetry, particularly poetry, because he was very into, after he passed, I had the opportunity to talk to Haki Madhubuti, and he said, his death was a great loss. And then I looked at his book collection. I said, I guess so for Third World Press, because I think he has every poetry book that they published, because one of his passionate interests was poetry. And he actually attended the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. We have images of him sitting right on the front row at the events, because at that time he was on faculty here at Jackson State. We have the William Lamson collection, and I'm just so sad that Karen Quay didn't live long enough to see that collection get processed. Karen Quay and Lee Lamson Quay, the survivors of William Lamson, generously donated his collection of over 900 maps. And that collection probably has over 100 linear feet of documents, because he was an expert witness in case, and he wrote dissertation length documents sometimes in support of cases, to explain his maps, to explain the impact of whether or not you put a hospital in a certain location, or how you draw school district lines or voting district lines. So those are awesome collections we have, that I've had the opportunity to either directly process traditionally or supervise students in the processing of those, because I've had some wonderful student support in terms of traditional processing. And I keep saying traditional processing because we also have digitized 50% of Margaret Walker's personal papers. And if you go to our website, we have her digital archives project, which has the bulk of those papers available for researchers to use, such as her journals, her correspondence, her notes from her Richard Wright biography are all available online now. And we have the HCAC grant through the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the History and Cultural Access grant, which is allowing us to digitize additional collections, including the William Lamson collection, the Frankie Adams Johnson Black Panther Party archives, are two collections in particular that are being digitized with that grant. So those are the kinds of things that I've been doing since arriving at the Margaret Walker Center in 2004.
Thank you. So I do want to ask you more about the collections and about your work specifically in your time at the Margaret Walker Center, but I think it might be helpful before we get to that to kind of like set the timeline, as it were.
Okay.
Because we'll be talking about Margaret Walker, but Margaret Walker wasn't here when you became archivist. So can you kind of set that timeline for us? Margaret Walker retired when?
Yes. Well, let's go up to when she came. Margaret Walker was born, of course, in 1915, July 7th, 1915, in Birmingham, Alabama. She spent a brief time of her childhood in Meridian, Mississippi, but the bulk of her childhood in New Orleans, Louisiana. And after completing her first 2 years of college in New Orleans at what's now Dillard University, she received her bachelor's degree from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, which happened to be her dad's and mom's alma mater. They both had the opportunity to attend Northwestern. Her dad received a theology degree from Northwestern. He was a Methodist. Her dad was a Methodist minister. He wasn't preaching. He was more of a teaching minister. He taught, and her mother was a music teacher and band leader. She stayed in Chicago after she graduated college and worked during the Great Depression in the Federal Writers Project, which gave her the opportunity to get to know a whole wide range of people, from Richard Wright to Studs Terkel to Sterling A. Brown to Langston Hughes, who she actually knew before she got to Chicago, but expanded her relationship with him while she was in Chicago. And then the federal government decided to shut down the Federal Writers Project. So in 1940, she decided to go back to graduate school, and she went to the State University of Iowa and received her bachelor's degree in 1942. And she not only received master's degree. She got her master's degree from Iowa. And for her master's thesis, instead of a traditional research paper, she did a book of poetry. She had originally published For My People in Poetry Journal in 1937. She had published before that in 1934 in the Crisis magazine, but 37 she published For My People in Poetry, which was important to her because it was a magazine she admired and she always wanted to be published in. And then as part of her graduation requirements, like I said, she did the book of poems with the title For My People. And she won the Yale Younger Poets Award. Third time's the charm. She actually had previously applied for the award twice and won it on the third try. And part of the prize was a publishing contract. Margaret Walker never had a consistent publisher. Just about everything she published was published by different publishers. So For My People was published by Yale University Press in 1942. And so she's a published, accomplished writer, but that don't pay the bills. So she starts teaching. She teaches briefly in Louisiana, Southern University. She goes to West Virginia State University. She teaches briefly there. She moves to North Carolina. She teaches at Livingstone College, and That's also significant because that's where she met her husband, Ernest Alexander, in North Carolina. And in 1949, she's like, I need a steady job. And Jackson State offered her, at that time, they were doing what they called one-year contracts. At that time, historically black institutions weren't really doing tenure in promotion the way tenure in promotion is done now. Oftentimes contracts were one-year contracts. And she says in her journals that when she came to Jackson, she was impressed with what she saw in Jackson. She saw a progressive black community. She saw a neighborhood, the Dalton Street area, which is right outside Jackson State, grew exponentially because of Jackson State, because of the faculty, but primarily the students. Because in the industrial arts department, a number of the homes up and down Dalton Street were built by students who were students in the industrial arts department. So you had literal homes being built right there in the community. So she comes to Jackson in 1949, initially by herself. Her two oldest children are with her parents. Her husband is still in North Carolina, and she hasn't had her youngest daughter yet. So she comes initially that first year by herself because I guess she really wants to make sure, when you're moving a whole family, she wants to make sure this is a stable place. And when she ends up being at Jackson State 30 years. So from a one-year appointment to, a full 30 years in the faculty in what they called at that time the language arts department, because it encompassed not only English, but also the modern foreign languages such as Spanish and French were also in speech communication were in that department. So that's why they call it the language arts department. And she immediately is seen as somebody with a real talent, especially when it comes to putting together programs. In 1952, Jackson State is celebrating 75 years of existence. Founded in 1877 in Natchez, it's Natchez Seminary. It's since moved to Jackson and ultimately to the Lynch Street area. But Dr. Jacob Reddix, who is the president of Jackson State at that time, charges Margaret Walker with developing a creative writing festival in celebration of the 75th anniversary of Jackson State. Some of it is controlled. He's like, we need to find something for her to do to keep her busy. But she brings Langston Hughes, she brings Sterling A. Brown, she brings Robert Hayden, she brings Melvin Tolson, she brings Owen Dotson, Arna Bontemp. She brings all of these writers to Jackson State to share their writing, their attitude, their knowledge, and it's interesting because she's not the only HBCU faculty or staff member in that delegation. At that time, Sterling A. Brown was the chair of the English department at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Arna Bontemps was actually a librarian at Fisk University. Melvin Tolson had taught at Wiley College. So most of these, in addition to being accomplished writers, Langston Hughes is one of the few who's literally just making a living writing. Most of these others are, in addition to writing, they're also teaching or working in a library setting. So that is a phenomenal event that she pulls off. She came in 49 and this was 52, so that's 3 years after her arrival. She's putting together a major conference. And Margaret Walker, and she makes no secret of it, one of her greatest inspirations is William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. He published her first poem in the Crisis magazine, a magazine he founded, and the significance of when her poem was published in the Crisis is Du Bois and Walter White had been having conflicts in actually like a month after her poem. She's one of the last poets to be published in the Crisis, with the founding editor, Du Bois, as the editor. He ultimately has to leave because of his conflicts with Walter White. But he says that education should do more than impart knowledge. It should help build communities. And that is something she learned from studying him, from growing up on the campus of Dillard, what's now Dillard University, that there's a challenge for educators to do more than just impart knowledge. They have to touch lives. They have to improve communities. And it's also something she knew as a Bible scholar. One of the courses she taught at Jackson State was Bible as literature. And she writes a book of poetry called Prophets for a New Day that, highlights some of her. And so she knows about the prophets, and they're talking about how the importance of community and building community. So she decides that she needs to develop a new program at Jackson State, and it's called Black Studies. Now, Margaret Walker knew people like John Heinrich Clark, Sinclair Drake. She and Sinclair Drake had actually worked together in Chicago. James Turner from Cornell University. She knew most of the leading scholars in what was a very brand new field called Black Studies. So in 1968, she develops what she calls the Institute for the Study of the History, Life, and Culture of Black People. Now, at Jackson State in 68 and even in 2023, there is no degree granting program in Black Studies. But what she does is she encourages departments to offer courses such as Black sociology, or the history of Black music, or African American literature in her own department, the language arts department, so that departments are looking at the impact of people of African descent on content areas across disciplines. But she also makes it a significant programming arm at Jackson State. So she has started in 1971 the National Evaluative Conference on Black Studies. Like I said, this is a field that's really just opened up since 1968. So this is an early conference looking at the impact and importance of Black studies, not only for educators, because Margaret Walker was never about an ivory tower approach to programming. She always wanted it to be something that would be beneficial to the local communities and would incorporate the local communities. In 1972, she was invited to the Centennial for Paul Laurence Dunbar in Dayton, Ohio. She grew up loving Paul Laurence Dunbar. In the earliest journal we have of hers, she transcribes one of Paul Laurence Dunbar's poems called The Party. That's an African vernacular English poem. She does a wonderful job of reciting it at the Centennial celebration, and luckily the Centennial celebration has audio of her reciting his poetry. But it was something, I knew a whole cadre of women who spent their childhood and young adulthoods being able to recite for competition, for programs, poems of Paul Laurence Dunbar. And so, and he was somebody she grew up knowing and loving. So when she got the opportunity to go to Dayton, she said, yes, I'm going. And on her way to Dayton, she spent the night in Effingham, Illinois. And she said, you know what? This is the centennial, the 100th birthday celebration for Paul Laurence Dunbar. But 1973 will be 200 years since Phillis Wheatley published her first book of poetry. And that's when she starts working out the ideas for the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. And even while she's in Dayton, she has opportunity to interact with Nikki Giovanni, Paula Giddings. You know, there Sonia Sanchez, all of whom will come the very next year to the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. She gets the chance to interact with them in Dayton and start laying that groundwork for that. So she starts, and it takes a year, and it's amazing because she not only gets all of that done, she went to graduate school with Elizabeth Catlett. She and Elizabeth Catlett were the exact same age. She was technically, Elizabeth Catlett was a little older than her, but they were both born in 1915. And they attended the University of Iowa together and were roommates. And then at a certain point, Elizabeth Catlett would become the first chair of the art department at Dillard in New Orleans. So that would extend the relationship there. And she says, we need something artistic to be representative of this festival. So she reaches out to Elizabeth Catlett the summer of 72, like July 1972, and said, we want you to do a bust of Phillis Wheatley, basically using the Scipio Moorhead engraving. That's the most popular image of Phillis Wheatley, to do a bronze bust. And using a wood base, Elizabeth Catlett creates a bronze bust of Phillis Wheatley and has it ready before November 1st, so like the end of October. It's ready, and it's at Jackson State on the 1st of November 1973, ahead of the November 4th through 7th Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. But she didn't just stop with the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. She did a conference on the plight of cities. So she was already looking at what's going on with urban areas. And as urban areas transition from being the primary source of income, entertainment, everything, to the suburbanization, which takes a lot from these cities. So she has a conference on that. She has a conference on Africa and African affairs, and she brings in African diplomats, scholars to Jackson State to talk about what's going on in post-colonial Africa in the 70s. So these are, and she has a creative writing festival in 1977. So throughout the 70s, she is hosting all of these conferences, because like I said, it's not a degree granting program, so it's primarily programming such as these conferences, but she's also bringing people like Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis to campus, Louis Farrakhan to campus, Alex Haley before they had their infamous falling out. She's bringing all of these, Maya Angelou. I actually had the opportunity to see Maya Angelou, who came to Jackson State because Margaret Walker invited her to come. The only writer that she really wanted to come, who never really could make time to come, was Gwendolyn Brooks. She had they were both writing in Chicago. Gwendolyn Brooks had a Pulitzer Prize, and she had always really wanted to bring her to campus, but it just, for whatever reasons, it just never worked out time-wise to get her here. So those were the kinds of things. And in the 80s, Margaret Walker became mobile. She started really getting into her space in terms of speaking. And she would be a delegate for Jesse Jackson at his 88 Democratic National Convention campaign. She's, she even had the opportunity to go to Norway, but since she didn't fly, she did take up the opportunity to do a Fulbright in Norway. But she's traveling throughout the country, speaking and talking about, she has this one topic she has that's called the Agenda for Action. It's not enough to her, it's not enough just to be a writer. That's good. It's not enough just to be a scholar. That's good. What is this going to do to improve the community and the people in the community? So that's what she worked on. And she was still writing in 1988, she would publish her biography of Richard Wright, you know, after a long, hard battle first with Ellen Wright, and then she had to change publishers, and then there was a lot of backlash because there were people who felt like, should she be writing about Richard Wright? You know, Dr. Mary Emma Graham, who writes Margaret Walker's biography, talks about how the first question she usually is asked is, was Margaret Walker in love with Richard Wright? So, you know, these are the kinds of questions people are, you know, assuming, oh, it's biased, because even Richard Wright's widow accused Margaret Walker of being a stalker. So those are kinds of things she had to deal with that, but she did get it published. As I mentioned, Margaret Walker never had the same publisher. She always, everything she published was published by somebody different. But after having published a collection of poetry called For My People, Prophets for a New Day, October Journey, which is actually probably my favorite collection of her poetry, is both historical and personal, because she has a wonderful poem to her dad in October Journey. She gets the opportunity to have the University of Georgia Press do what they call a collected work, which means it's the bulk of her poems from all of her previous books of poetry, plus some new poetry she did specifically for that book. It is called This Is My Century, because she said, you know, she was born in 1915 and she would die in 1998, so the 20th century was her century. But what that publishing also does is it gives her a way to handle permissions, because one of the things she gets in an agreement with the University of Georgia Press to do is to handle permissions for her poetry. And I can tell you, as archivist, that is what she is most in demand for from other publishers, is her poetry. Most anthologies have it. If they don't have For My People, they have Lineage. And in some cases, they may have 2 or 3 of her other poems as well. And so what's wonderful about that arrangement is that we get a copy. So we have this wide array of anthologies, from traditional college textbook anthologies, high school African American literature anthologies, to Caroline Kennedy did a collection of her mother's favorite poems and Margaret Walker's lineages. In that collection, when schools were doing the No Child Left Behind content area testing, Margaret Walker's lineage was used in the Massachusetts and the Florida content area test as one of the questions. So we have all of that as well. She had the opportunity to be honored. One of my favorite pictures of Margaret Walker, she's in New York in the 1980s celebrating Langston Hughes. Is actually the City University of New York, SUNY, is hosting a Langston Hughes Festival. And she is kind of the keynote speaker at that, because she was a mentee and friend of Langston Hughes, but she's there with Toni Morrison standing directly behind her, you know. And that's significant because in 1965, after much turmoil and fight at Jackson State to go back and get her PhD, because the administration didn't want her to go and get her PhD, she did in 65 get her PhD from the State University of Iowa. And again, she's in the Writers Workshop program, and she did her only novel, Jubilee, which is the story of her maternal family, her mother's family, from enslavement to freedom. So it spans from about 1837 to 1875. So you have antebellum, Civil War, and Reconstruction era, and that's how she divides the book up. She spent 30 years researching Jubilee. Her grandmother would always tell her stories about what it was like growing up enslaved and how they navigated that transition from enslavement to freedom and moving from Georgia to Alabama. And her mother hated it. She said, stop telling her all those tales, all those harrowing tales. And her, Margaret Walker's grandmother would get hurt and say, I'm not telling her tales, I'm telling her the naked truth. And Margaret Walker always wanted to acknowledge and validate her grandmother's story. So that's why she spent 30. She actually had 300 pages of Jubilee already done when she graduated from Northwestern, and that's undergraduate school. But it wasn't until 1965 that she would complete her dissertation. And she is able to graduate not only with a dissertation, but with a publishing contract from Houghton Mifflin and a fellowship which allowed her to do the rewrites and the edits. What I always love as an archivist when I share documents from her Jubilee is that students go, oh, you mean even professional writers have to rewrite? And I'm like, yes, there's a lot of research and writing and rewriting that goes into publishing a novel that's been in continuous print since it was published in 1966. So she has all of that experience that she takes with her when she goes on the road and she's talking in support of students who are protesting limited academic freedoms. Because she's one person I met who knew her said the greatest gift she gave him is she enforced for him that he had a voice. He had a right to have his own opinion, and if that opinion wasn't popular, that was okay. It was his opinion. He didn't have to agree with the masses, and he was like, that was a eye-opening experience. And so, and a number of her students say one of the things that they love most about her is the way she empowered them as students. My own mother, in her autobiography, my mother always said that Margaret Walker was one of those people who said, you can do it, baby. You can do whatever you put your mind to. So that was the kind, and that's what she kind of took on the road too. So when she had the opportunity to speak at places like Spelman College or to speak in New York or Chicago, she had the opportunity shortly before she passed to go back to Chicago and be honored in the Chicago Writers Hall of Fame, and and she was always talking about, okay, it's not just about writing, it's about community, and how do we, improve community, how do we collaborate and work together, and I think that's some of our richest legacy as the Margaret Walker Center is that idea of community collaboration that she definitely brought to it.
Well, thank you for elaborating on Margaret Walker's life and timeline. So it sounds like because of your positionality, growing up in Jackson, your parents being JSU alum, that you've had the opportunity to meet a lot of people who were either inspired by or educated by Margaret Walker. What would you say, like, her legacy has been for you as an archivist, perhaps?
That spirit of empowerment really is, I think it's one of the greatest things. I'm preparing for a presentation I'm doing in September at the Department of Archives and History, and I was looking back at a letter June Jordan wrote to Margaret Walker saying, yes, ma'am, I'll be there, just excited about coming to the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. And, and that's part of what she did. She gave you, I had the opportunity, Roland Freeman just passed. I had the opportunity to meet him because of Margaret Walker and because he felt inspired to curate a collection of his photographs and entitle it For My People for the 50th anniversary of the Yale Younger Poets Award. So yeah, that, that empowerment and the connections, because Margaret Walker, when she was working on her rewrites for her dissertation and for the book, would often go to the Pineywood School, where I also worked. The academic director at Pineywood was Dr. Zilpha Ellen Chandler, who also had a PhD in English from Iowa, and she became kind of a on the ground in Mississippi mentor for Margaret Walker. Plus, it gave her a place free of distractions where she could relax and, really focus on writing. But yeah, that spirit of collaboration and empowerment and how to incorporate who you are as a person of faith with who you are as a scholar and a person of action.
That's actually very inspiring. And I suppose your position as an archivist and handling Margaret Walker's journals, especially in working towards the digitization, I think you said 50% of her papers, her journals, would give you quite an insight into who Margaret Walker was, what she was about, what she was thinking about, particularly for something like the planning of these many conferences and festivals throughout the 70s that you mentioned. I wonder if you could talk more about, in particular, her thinking towards the Phillis Wheatley Festival, and, just your knowledge of what that experience was like.
Well, Margaret Walker was a scholar of African American literature. She had written an essay about women and how often in the Harlem Renaissance you hear about Langston Hughes, you hear about County Cullen, you hear about Claude McKay, male writers mostly. But there were people like Georgia Douglas Johnson writing, Ann Spencer writing, wonderful poetry during that period. Before that time period, people knew about Paul Laurence Dunbar, but his ex-wife, Alice Dunbar Nelson, was a terrific poet. Some of her poetry, wow, I'm awed by it today, and she's writing in the late 1870s to the early 20th century, and she's also a teacher and activist. So, this was somebody else who inspired me that you can do. But she saw women were often invisible. Alice Walker said that happened for two reasons: one, they're black, and two, they're women. And even at the heart of the Black arts movement, the forefront were Amiri Baraka, Haki Madhubuti, Larry Neal, Addison Gale. These are all men. But you also have women writing: Nikki Giovanni, Sonia Sanchez, June Jordan, Audre Lorde. And then you have, in adding to the invisibility of gender, sexuality, because June Jordan is, an out and proud bisexual. Audre Lorde is a lesbian, and a lot of times that really gets, thrown. And she said, our children are not being exposed to, and it's very similar to what Ron DeSantis is trying to perpetrate in Florida today, what Sarah Huckabee Sanders is trying to do in Arkansas, make sure children aren't exposed to people of color, people from the LGBT community. And she's saying, so she actually used the phrase Hidden Figures before the movie came out, that she wanted the Phillis Wheatley Festival to do several things. One, to highlight who Phillis Wheatley was. Phillis Wheatley is not even a real name. Phillis is the name of the ship. When she was kidnapped and brought to America, they gave her the name of the ship she came in on. So that's where the Phillis comes from. And the Wheatley is from John and Susanna Wheatley, the people who purchased her in Boston. So we don't know anything about who Phillis Wheatley really was, except when you read some of her poetry And she talks about being snatched from her parents and how she thinks they must feel not being able to ever see her again. So for one thing, she wants people to know who Phillis Wheatley was and do a resurgence of looking critically at her poetry, because oftentimes it would get dismissed as, too Eurocentric or whatever people would say. But if you really read some of the poetry, and if you know the stories about people who attacked her, there's no way a slave woman wrote this. Somebody else wrote this and put her name on it. These are the kinds of issues so she wanted people to come away from the Phillis Wheatley Festival with a greater appreciation of who Phillis Wheatley was. And she did that several ways. Because first of all, she knew most people did not have the attention span to sit through lectures. So she invited Vonnie Burroughs, who did a series of vignettes, little plays with music and dancing that talked about Phillis Wheatley, included Phillis Wheatley's poetry. She had Tommy Stewart to recite Phillis Wheatley's poetry to an instrument of the period, a harpsichord. She had a collection, a exhibit of archival documents related to Phillis Wheatley in 18th century writing that was on display in the library during the course of the festival. She had a public policy forum at the end of the festival to talk specifically about Phillis Wheatley and her impact, plus the impact of Black women in general on publishing today. So there was this, looking at the past, Phillis Wheatley, but then, okay, what's going on with women writers right now? We have Maya Angelou, we have Toni Morrison, we have Nikki Giovanni, Alice Walker, June Jordan, Sonia Sanchez, Lucille Clifton. We have all these women writing. What is their experience writing? Are they combating that sense of invisibility? Because the civil rights movement was very sexist. Oftentimes, Zora Neale Hurston said a long time ago, Black women are muse of the world. So oftentimes women did the work, but men got the credit. They did the decision making. One of the interesting things about SNCC and about this space and what was going on in Mississippi is that you have people like Victoria Gray Adams, Fannie Lou Hamer, Annie Devine, Ann Moody, and others who were carving out a space of leadership and empowerment for women of color in the movement, particularly Black women. So she's looking at, how are women fitting into this? Because the Black arts movement had largely been defined by the men of the movement. And oftentimes, some of them were sympathetic to women. Haki Matabuchi wrote a wonderful essay for The Black Aesthetic, which was edited by Addison Gale, that includes highlighting several of the women who were actually at the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. But people like Stanley Crouch who were saying, well, they're just getting attention because they're women. And in the case of people like Audre Lorde, they're getting attention because they're not only women, but they're lesbians and, so you're dealing with all. So what does it mean to be a Black woman writer in 1973? We've looked at what it means in 73, but what does it mean in 1973? Are they getting published? Because one of the things she did, yes, she had highlighted very out there, very well-known writers, but she also had up-and-coming writers like her own daughter, Marian Alexander, Carol Gregory, women who were just beginning to find themselves as writers. So you had these people who were, really in most ways better set in terms of publishing than she was, because, Nikki and certain others, they had publishers and literary agents and all of this stuff. So you had that group, but then you had the up and coming writers. But she also had women of her generation. I call them the Margaret tribe because it's Margaret Danner, Margaret Walker, and Margaret Burroughs. But also Mari Evans, who's also of that age range. And what do they see in the women of today, and what do they remember the women who inspired them, and what it was like for them as they came out as writers, and what does it mean for the community? Because Margaret Walker wanted the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival to not just be something that would be in Dansby Hall or the Jacob L. Reddick's Student Union or the Heidelberg Hotel. She wanted to be something that community could relate to and be impacted by and touched by. And that's why she made sure that she involved students, alumni, faculty, facilities, GSU Diners. She made sure everybody was involved in the planning. One of the really wonderful things she did is she developed what she called shepherds. She assigned a JSU faculty member to each poet, and they were responsible for making sure they knew how to navigate from, the Jacob L. Reddick Student Union to the Heidelberg Hotel, and then to Dansby Hall, and to get to the classrooms, because they took the writers to the classroom spaces. They took writers. There's a wonderful picture of 4 of the writers on what was then a local television show called Coffee with Judy. Judy Denson was originally a weather anchor, and for WLBT, she developed a morning talk show called Coffee with Judy. And so Carolyn Rogers, Margaret Burroughs, Sonia Sanchez, they're all, appearing with her, talking about being in Jackson for the Phillis Wheatley Poetry. So, she wanted to make sure that it was a collaborative effort, not just with Jackson State, but with the community. And the other hook she had used to get it financed was the bicentennial of the United States, which was coming up in 1976. And with Phillis Wheatley being someone who wrote in the 18th century during that time period, she got money from the Mississippi Bicentennial Commission, the Mississippi Arts Commission. Stewart Rockoff very proudly says one of the first events was now the Mississippi Humanities Council, what was then the Mississippi Commission for Humanities, sponsored was the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. So and of course Jackson State, all sponsored financially the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. But she also reached out to, Charlene Hunter Galt was here not as a poet, but as a journalist. And she wrote a wonderful article for the New York Times. Carol Parks came from Black World magazine, and they did Black World was a magazine of Johnson Publishing in Chicago. And they did a full spread. Matter of fact, it was a cover. The Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival was a cover article for one of the issues of Black World magazine. Ebony magazine did a full spread on the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. Freedom Ways, one of the best articles, Freedom Ways, Charles Rowell and Jerry Ward did a day-by-day detailed recount and review of every event. They even mentioned, like, they saw Sarah Webster Fabio, and they lamented that she was on a session with several other people, because just like Nikki Giovanni had a solo session, they said, Sarah Webster Fabio could have been on a solo session. So, you get to know all those kinds of things about the festival and how different writers were received, because Margaret Walker found, she said, she knows she's too much of a prude and a Victorian for some of the writers, because, this is a time when a lot of the language seemed to be, to her at least, for shock value. It's a lot of, coarse language and graphic scenes, and she's like, oh, okay. But they have a right to, they're writing what they feel, and so that's, until you get the intergenerationality of it. You get, young women talking to older women, women who are no longer bound by, respectability politics, as they call it now, versus women who that's what they grew up with. You had to be a proper young lady at all times and realize that you're being representative of the race wherever you go, and so you have and it would lead to a book. Paula Gidding, who was also here, not as a writer at that time, even though she's a wonderful writer now, she was editor at Howard University Press, and she put together the book Poetic Equation, which was a discussion between Margaret Walker and Nikki Giovanni.
That's actually fairly common when great writers or theoretical minds would sit down and have debates and stuff. People would record them and then just publish that as a book. Mm-hmm. I think I read one between Margaret Mead and James Baldwin.
But you say that in the June Jordan letter where she's confirming she's coming, she talks about Margaret Walker introducing her to Kuhn's book, Scientific Revolution, and how she turned her on to that book. So, you see the discussion.
Yeah, definitely. I can only imagine the kinds of thoughts and ideas and discussions that were born out of attending that conference, besides Paula Gidding's book and all of the newspaper articles you mentioned. I'm sure that folks who just attended, generally speaking.
Joanne Gavin, who's coming to the 50th reconvening, she developed what she calls Furious Flower, which happens about every 10 years. And it's very similar to the Phillis Wheatley Poetry, largely inspired by the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival. Nikki Giovanni did a tribute event to Toni Morrison. And the first thing she said at the press conference was, this is going to be the greatest reassembling of Black women writers since Margaret Walker had the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival at Jackson State. So yeah, it definitely inspired. Delta Sigma Theta sorority, it's 1977, I believe, will record a double album LP of poetry and music together, and it's called Roses and Revolutions. The title actually comes from a Dudley Randall poem, who was at the Phillis Wheatley as a publisher. He published one of Margaret Walker's books of poetry, and what he calls, he was from Detroit, and he was a publisher of Broadside Press, as well as a poet himself. And so and what I love about that album is Margaret Walker's For My People is on each side of the 4 albums, 4 sides. So they do, two stanzas per. And they have one of the surviving founders of Delta Sigma Theta, Osceola McCarty Adams, who actually reads the poem throughout. So yeah, Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival inspired a lot.
That's beautiful to hear. And so the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival happened in 1973. Margaret Walker went on to host a series of other events at JSU, and then she retired, and then she gave her papers, or sold
yes,
her papers
sold her papers
to
to Jackson.
JSU. And Dr. Harrison, Alfredine Harrison, went on to continue her sort of
Yes.
legacy with the Margaret Walker Center. Can you talk us through that process a little bit and then how you came on board?
Oh, okay, yes. You know, Dr. Harrison was fortunate in that she had the opportunity to be mentored by Dr. Alexander, by Margaret Walker, because Dr. Harrison came to Jackson State in 1972. So Margaret Walker would be working at Jackson State for another 7 years. So she had that experience of being able to be under her tutelage in terms of her work. But she also developed, here again, Margaret Walker was like, you don't have to just carbon copy what I do. Do what you were passionate about. And Dr. Albertine Harrison was passionate about oral history. She was passionate about historic preservation. She was passionate about archives. So she had the opportunity, she was passionate about community. And so she got a chance to do all of that, you know, starting with, like I said, with the oral histories first, and doing, you know, collecting and encouraging students to collect oral history, because most of her oral history projects were student-driven. You know, there were topics that she assigned to students, but they did the lion's share of the work in terms of selecting the narrators and putting together the interviews and things, such as the Head Start project with, you know, Lavery Jones Sr., because she had a daughter named Lavery Jones, who's also popular, you know, largely spearheaded that Head Start, because she had been not only a Head Start worker, but a Head Start parent in the Mississippi Delta. And so she did, you know, a phenomenal job of collecting that, you know, oral histories on that. We had the opportunity as the Margaret Walker Center to collaborate with the City of Jackson as the City of Jackson was developing a City of Jackson drive-in tour, civil rights. And part of that civil rights tour is, and you've seen all the boxes, transcripts and tapes of civil rights movement, was interviewing people, talking about to put together what would ultimately be a guide, a really excellent resource helping people, you know, do a self-guided drive-in tour of Jackson in terms of civil rights. And so those, you know, kinds of things. And then, as I mentioned, Dr. Harrison had the opportunity to work with the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Park Service to develop the archival program at Jackson State. And as I mentioned, you know, collecting archival collections from throughout the state. You know, everything from Amanda McCall's little scrapbook of her grandmother's favorite sayings to the large collections on education in Mississippi with H.M. and Cleopatra Thompson and John and Frida Powell and Wayne Calvert and others who were involved in Mississippi education. And the Women Power Unlimited, which was a movement of middle-class women in support of the civil rights movement, and the Oxford Development Association, which was the city of Oxford, which is where the University of Mississippi is located, is known for difficult relationships with the African American community. And a group of people from Oxford said, you know, we can support ourselves through cooperatives. And so they developed economic cooperatives to support the community in Oxford. And that became the Oxford Development Association.
We've just passed the hour mark, and I just want to make sure you're okay. How are you doing? Good. A little thirsty. wanted to make sure that, I'd given you an opportunity to speak on any topics that I hadn't asked a question about. If there's anything you wanted to share on the record, either, about your life or your, experiences working in the archive or your knowledge of Margaret Walker. And
Well, one of the things I want to share is I'm always learning something new, and that's what I love about archival work. I discovered these wonderful letters from Alice Walker to Margaret Walker. One of them, Alice Walker credits Margaret Walker with introducing her to Zora Neale Hurston. And when Alice Walker comes to the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival, while everybody else is reading from their poetry primarily, she reads from In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which is an essay she'll publish in Ms. Magazine, and then, it helps take off the womanist theoretical movement, particularly in literature. And so, finding these little jewels like that, or the June Jordan letter where she talks about, how inspired she is by Sister Margaret Walker Alexander, as she calls her. But it's always something, wonderful and new, and having the opportunity to interact with researchers and visitors and students, all of it is wonderful. It's what I love about archival work.
that's beautiful. I know just, from my experience being a colleague and a coworker, like you've brought to meetings various things you've found in the archives, especially when we started thinking about and planning the Phillis Wheatley Festival, like programs and all sorts of things. And I have to wonder, like, the kind of forethought it took either for Margaret Walker or for Dr. Harrison, who I assume attended the Phillis Wheatley Festival, right, to save all of those things.
And like I said, Margaret Walker had a good role model in her dad. And Margaret Walker loved archivists. For example, the Schomburg, she was close to Lawrence Reddick, Gene Hudson, and Howard Dotson, all of whom were, directors, heads of the Schomburg in New York. One of her nearest and dearest friends who actually came to the Phillis Wheatley Poetry Festival was Dorothy Porter Wesley, who was the director of the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University. She also knew people like, Arna Bontemps, who is at Fisk University Library, and they have a wonderful archival collection as well. She researched in the Georgia archives and the Alabama archives and the National Archives. So she loved libraries and archives. She was a reader, a writer, a researcher, so archives combine, the best of all those worlds. And like I said, every time she had something major, she invited archivists. She invited people like Jean Carney Smith, who was archivist at Fisk University after the retirement of Arna Bontemps, and Alan Shockley, who was also at Fisk and was probably one of the earliest writers of lesbian fiction. She invited her to events as well. So she knew, like I said, she loved, even with all the turmoil connected to it, she enjoyed her research time at the Meineke at Yale. So she had all these wonderful opportunities to participate in archival research and get to know archivists, that it always stuck with her. And it was something that she felt was important for students and for writers, because when she wrote Jubilee, she was writing a novel because she thought it would be more accessible than a history book. Because a lot of times people's eyes glaze up when you say history. But she said if you present it, because it's a lot of historical information in Jubilee, but she presents it in a fictionalized, semi-fictionalized way, because most of it is true, except for, of course, dialogue that she had no access to. And one of the, this is an archival thing that she talks about in her journals, because Margaret Walker always started her first draft of most things in her journal. She wrote her reaction to things in her journal. And she talks about when she was, preparing her dissertation, which was Jubilee, people like, are people going to be able to understand and read the, African-American vernacular English or dialects? And she said, this is the way my grandmother spoke. And I want to be authentic to who she was and who her family was. So, she was inspired also by Du Bois, because she inserts a lot of spirituals, or what he calls sorrow songs, in the headings, in the body of the stories, because here again, that's who her grandmother was, because I'm pretty sure she grew up hearing her grandmother sing, spirituals and things. So it's about, she studied flora and fauna of Alabama and Georgia to make sure that the plant life and the animal life she represented in the book was accurate to what would have been there in the 19th century in that particular area. And all of this is information you get from her archives, because she took copious notes, and she, like I said, she always, and she was very transparent in her journals. So, but I always tell people they're not linear, because oftentimes she's an analytical but non-linear thinker, meaning she will go back, something happened in 1942, but she'll come in 1972 reflecting back on something that, so you have to know that what she's talking about actually happened in 1942, even though she's writing, reflecting on it in 1972. But the greatest thing is her transparency about her relationship with her mom. Her mom was a woman who, on the one hand, felt constrained by what was expected of an early 20th century black woman, to be a wife and mother and teacher. That's it, And she was kind of like Paul Laurence Dunbar talking about, I know why the cage bird sings. And she took out a lot of that frustration on her daughter. And usually it was Margaret, because her younger children learned no good can come out of trying to argue with mama. Mama is always right. Even if she's wrong, she's right. But Margaret was always that child with why. And, if her mom would say something, and finally her dad told her, just write it down, because his attitude was happy wife, happy life. His attitude is, I want to be living with this woman after you're hopefully gone and living your own life. So instead of, feeling you have to challenge everything your mother says, even if it's, 'cause even if she's coming at you, as kids would say now, kind of sideways, and she would do, and she learned to do that. So she would have an argument with her mom, and she would sit down. My mom is the most horrible human being in the world. She da 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 da. And then you could literally read into her journal aside. She's like, my mom's not that bad, because I'm living with her right now, and I understand I've brought myself and 3 children. She already has her two youngest children, and it's a lot on her. And so, you can see her trying to work out. So it started out with my mom's a monster, to she just needs to be and the older it becomes, you can see that what people used to say, just keep on living, that gets thrown into it. I didn't understand what she was going through because she didn't even she realized later that her dad was actually throwing her mom under the bus because he was one of those dads who would retreat rather than engage his children. And that made his wife had to be the bad guy, you know, because he would go and, you know, hide in his books while his wife and children are, you know, hashing out.
Go ask your mother.
But it puts the mother in a position of always having to be the bad guy, you know. And daddy's, you know, he's so nice. But then she realized, no, he's not. He was just throwing mama under the bus and every opportunity he could. But you get all of that, you know, out of her journals because she's very transparent, you know, her issues in her marriage. You know, she and her husband, they actually had their oldest daughter before they got married. And they got together, but she's like, what have I gotten myself into? This isn't working. So that's when she comes back home, and her mom's like, told you not to marry that man in the first place, you know. But you get to see all of that in her journals, you know, her severe, what we would call postpartum depression after each pregnancy. You know, all of these things, you know, gets, you know, written down. And you also get to see a lot of times in the early 20th century, if a woman had a strong opinion, there was something wrong with her. You know, she needs some, you know, Valium, some sedatives, nightly, because she's, you know, it's all this, you know, this. So, but, you know, and you see her, you know, working through all that. You see her working through a sexist, you know, she's working with all black people, but the men are very sexist. They're very, you know, we think you should just do this. You know, for example, when she decided to go back for a dissertation, they were like, well, but who's going to teach your classes? And she's like, that's what, all you have to do is give me the release time. She ultimately had to go over their heads to the head of IHL, who was like, why are you troubling her about who's teaching? That's, you all pick, but she's free to go to get her PhD, you know, so. And she talks a lot about that in academia, you know, it's not just racist, it's sexist. And, you know, she's like, I'm making less money than people who I know I'm smarter than and have more education than, but because I'm a woman, and, you know, they're making, well, he's the head of a household. She's like, I am too. So, you know, this, it highlights a lot of the complexity of the people she worked with, because oftentimes men who had no power outside of the power they could wield in a all-black school situation took that power very seriously, and sometimes in, you know, could be destructive ways. And so she had to, you know, she talks very rawly and honestly, you know, about that.
Yeah, that's a shame.
Yeah.
But no, I related very strongly to what you said about Margaret Walker being an analytical but non-linear thinker. And I think as an oral historian, you find that that's more common, that the mind isn't a very linear place. And it makes sense. It does. When we're talking about Margaret Walker and we're talking about the events that she put on and the people that she, you know, gathered, there's this kind of web of interconnectivity that's not linear.
Right.
When you think about the program, the Phillis Wheatley Festival itself, right? Sure, you're looking at Phillis Wheatley in 1773 and you're looking at now and you're having intergenerational conversations, and it seems like, okay, connecting the past to the present to the future should be pretty linear, but it's not, because all of those relationships build upon each other and then build back and move forward. So it only makes sense that her journals would reflect that, because it's the nature of living and being human.
And it's also a broadness of mind. You know, I was reading an article in Esquire, the latest issue of Esquire, about evangelicals. And even though Margaret Walker was a deeply religious person, it didn't prevent her from being able to deal and appreciate and sympathize with gay and lesbian community. You know, just things that most people would say. Nowadays, in very evangelical, you gotta, you can't.
It's closed-minded.
And she loved horoscope, and a lot of, evangelical, but she loved doing charts. That was one of her pastimes, doing charts. I mean, and she would do natal charts, she would do charts for events, and she would analyze these charts. And what sometimes make her journals challenging for researchers is if sometimes researchers I just need this information right here. But you're not gonna find it in one journal spelled out. Sometimes you have to look all over because she's talking about.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the researching thing too, because when you were talking about the research that she put into Jubilee, for instance, it came to my mind that when we teach and talk about Margaret Walker to people who visit the center, we always say she was a writer, she was a teacher, she was a poet, all of these things. And I never mentioned a researcher, but that is a huge part of who she was, clearly. And so thinking about her journals, thinking about the archive in general, I wonder, if she would be proud of researchers who are learning about her, doing the research, and so I wonder if you can talk a little bit, maybe sort of to close the interview, about, how researchers can use the Margaret Walker Center as an archive, how they can view Margaret Walker's journals, that sort of thing, yeah.
Thank you for that question, because that's actually wonderful, especially right now. As of today, we are currently out of the building due to some challenges we've had in the building, but fortunately, we have it's called the Digital Archives Project for Margaret Walker's papers on our website. You go to the Margaret Walker website, and you'll see Digital Archives Project, and it has a link for researchers. And there you can find her journals. We have over 130 of her journals digitized, every page of the journals in terms of pages that have actually something on it, because she had a number of journals where she just had no page, she just started a new journal rather than finishing the previous one. And like I said, her notes for Richard Wright, and it's in her correspondence. We have all of that online. The thing to understand, though, the only thing we hold copyright to is what she wrote. So we have letters from June Jordan and Alice Walker and Norman Donaldson at Yale University and all variety of places. You would have to get permission from their estates or from them to use their letters to Margaret Walker.
So like you can look at them,
but you can't
like print them or
right.
quote them.
But they're there. And it's been wonderful because I've been working with a researcher who's investigating Margaret Walker's suit against Alex Haley. And we've been out of the building, but I've been able to direct her to journal entries, and center the links, to center the links. And that's another thing, you can reach out to me directly via email. And what's available, I can help direct researchers to what's available online right now while we're out of the building. But we also have a researcher form on the website. Just click on that PDF, fill it out, email it back to us, and we have Margaret mwa@gsums.edu is our general email address. So you can send it to that address. It'll get directed to me or whoever. If they're interested in oral histories, it'll get directed to you, and we go from there, because that researcher form allows us to know exactly what they're looking for. And that helps us, because sometimes people want things that are not at the Margaret Walker Center, but they may be at the university archives. So, you know, it helps us to distinguish between that too.
Right. And thanks to your like almost 20 years of experience working with these archives, like you're more than adept at being able to pinpoint exactly where in various journals over multiple years,
Yes.
Margaret Walker may have spoken about a particular theme. And even beyond that, just for your general knowledge, like, you know, if someone else has done research and written a book about
Right.
this thing. And so you're a wealth and a resource
Thank you.
in and of yourself, even besides the journals that you know so well. So yeah, being able to aid researchers in that way, I think Margaret Walker would probably be very proud of you.
And thank you. And it requires an open mind, because what I've always told students, when I worked at the high school level, students would come in working on a science fair project, and they want, do you have a book on the effect of music on plants? I would say no. I think that's what you're supposed to be looking up. Figuring out, you know, working out, trying to figure it out. But I do have books on music. I have books on plants. And, you know, so sometimes, you know, you have to piece, it's a patchwork quilt, you know, it's not gonna be just, you know, and I think when researchers come with an open mind, they often say, well, you know, I was looking for this, but when I got into this, it was like, wow, you know, so, you know.
Well, I want to thank you again for all of your time, and
Thank you. This
thought
has been
in
wonderful.
doing this. I hope that, you know, we have more opportunities to do interviews like this. But it's been really enlightening for me, and I look forward to transcribing it and getting it back to you. I'll give you the audio sooner, but the transcript.
And she would be so happy and proud of you, because first of all, you're a very smart woman, very articulate and intelligent. She would love that. But also, Margaret Walker loved New York. And she had a colleague here at Jackson State who was the first African-American woman to get a PhD from Columbia Teachers College. And so she knows about Columbia. She knew Zora Neale Hurston, who, you know, spent a little time at Columbia. So yeah, she would be anthropology and oral history. She'd be like, yay!
Oh, I'm happy to hear that. Thank you very much. I hope I do her proud.
Yes.
All right, well, I'm going to stop the recording there.